Welcome to the Undiscovered Gems podcast, hosted by NBA legend and business powerhouse Charles D. Smith, highlighting today's best and brightest business minds.
Hello, and welcome back to Undiscovered Gems. I'm Charles D. Smith, and I'm your host. And today we have Dr. Grant Venerable, known as Dr. V. Yes, I got to tell you, he's a professional year, and you are getting ready for a ride because this man is brilliant. His umbrella company is called ArtMolecular Concepts. Under that umbrella are many facets. And what he does in his life, he is a philosophical experimentalist. What do we mean by that? He experiments everything that he touches. And we're going to have a good time talking about quite a few things. I can tell you right now, the time in this show is not enough. I'm going to tell you in advance, but put on your seatbelt and let's go for a ride. Dr. V, how are you today?
Well, I'm fine. I'm glad I'm fine.
Good. So open up. Tell us a little bit about the overarching title of a experimentalist, a philosophical experimentalist.
It means one day I discovered sometime in my 50s, I realized I do experiments on everything I think about, and not just in a laboratory that has formal instrumentation, but that's where I developed the discipline to think experimentally about everything in my life. I do that especially with the news, which can get very thick and chaotic, but it can be addressed with an experimental approach, an ethos of experimentation, where you develop a simple hypothesis that says what's going on here. And then you develop benchmarks for testing your hypothesis. So one of the most important outcomes of an experimental ethos is being able to predict. If you have a hypothesis, it has to predict something, preferably. And so there's almost nothing in our lives that does not yield itself to that test. It's how I've been able to succeed where I succeeded, and then in places in life where I didn't succeed, where I expected to succeed, I had to go back to the drawing board of hypothesis and test. And that didn't start to happen until I got to graduate school at the University of Chicago, which is probably the best university for that to happen, because if nothing, it is philosophical in its experimental approach. It teaches the students, and it develops faculty who are experts on that. Now, there's historic background to that, which places like Chicago are expert with. And we see a lack of that in really higher education today. And it comes under the label of a lack of critical thinking, where you've heard that word misused, particularly in the political arena, when certain people are bearing down on what's called critical race theory. But
Can I interject for 1 second, Dr. V? Because I want to come back to critical thinking, but let's go back a second and I guess we can digress. We need to know your background. We need to understand how you got to where you are today. So tell us a little bit about your background.
It started with parents in Los Angeles who were remarkable people. My father was born in 1904. That's a long time ago. My mother was born in 1916, not quite as long ago. One of the realities of my growing up was my mother's short lifetime and early passing from what we call malignant hypertension, which in 1950, the medical field didn't really know what to do about it or its side effects, such as kidney dysfunction. So it knocked out her kidneys, and there was nothing medically that could be done. So she was gone before Christmas in 1950. That was probably my first opportunity for experimental thinking as an 8-year-old. And my brother and sister was 6 brother was 5. So that impacted us. How is this single father, who is a civil engineer by training, going to do his profession as well as raise his children, which he did, which she really made him swear he would do that. So he did. And so that too, growing up was an experimental process. We knew less day to day of what was going to happen. Well, people don't really know day to day anyway, but we have illusions where we think we know what's going to happen because we make appointments, we make plans, and usually they work. But what if you go through a lot of experience where the plans aren't working too well? When mother's not there, somebody else has to be, when somebody else has to be there. So that was my father's sister, who was 11 years older than he was. So at 57 years of age, she comes and makes meals for us, and gets us up in the morning, makes sure we're dressed properly, we're fed, and then she goes back home just a mile and a half away to take care of her husband, Uncle Bill. So that was Aunt Neosho and Uncle Bill. They were large factors in making sure we succeeded, that we reached adulthood. So we all went to college. We went to different colleges. I
And what
applied.
college?
I went to UCLA,
Oh, great.
University of
And which
California, Los Angeles, which is, I didn't realize it was the great school it was when I entered in 1960. I had the impression, well, this is just an athletic empire. It's a football school. It's a basketball school. It's a track and field school, but it was much more. But I applied over my head. So that was an experiment I had to deal with, and fell on my face, because I applied to 6 Ivy League caliber universities. There wasn't much of anything like what's called affirmative action or DEI today. There were always ways to keep youngsters of color out of college, particularly the best colleges. I applied to my father's school, which was Caltech. It took me for years to figure out how in the world he decided to go to Caltech, where he went before Caltech, which was the original UCLA in the early 1920s, UC Berkeley for a year, USC for 3 years, and then he didn't get his mathematics bachelor's at Caltech in 27 when he was supposed to. So he decided to bear down, study up, and get into Caltech, which he did. And I'm not even sure today how he did it, but he did it. He succeeded there. He won over the faculty. The administrators were not always the most complimentary people, but the president actually did not stand in his way. I'll put it like that. This was an era of eugenics in Southern California corporate life. What is eugenics? It means good genes. But to the foundations of eugenics, it meant exclusionary principles to eliminate the inferior peoples of planet Earth and aggrandize and raise up the superior race of planet Earth, which was presumed to be in the Nordic countries of origin. And even then, it was anti-Semitic. That was not a tenet that eugenics favored. So it wanted a Christian Protestant system, and that was the elite. So anyway, that's written up now in my memoir, which is released on Wednesday through Barnes and Noble, through Amazon, through Apple, and it tells the stories. It's ebooks, quite a lengthy.
A few.
So I'll refer to what's in there, but what really it starts with ancestors. It is said that African American people don't know much about their ancestry before the Civil War. There just aren't the records. Fortunately, my mother's parents kept everything they had. So their records take us back to the late 1700s. So I know quite a bit about my great grandmother, great grandmother, grandparents, all the way up through my parents. And it makes a
Right.
story you never hear about. You don't read about it in textbooks. It's not the kind of story the people that are now trying to come into power don't want people to hear it. Because there was more success in that period of slavery than anyone ever thought there was. And that's what comes out in the book once others tell their stories. If you didn't grow up, if your ancestors didn't have a totally oppressive circumstance, they had a chance to succeed by at least surviving. If you survived to have children, they had children, they have children, but they learned from ancestors. They adjusted their brains to figure out, how do we survive better with each generation? That's the key to the whole thing. And that's how my dad was survived to get into something like Caltech and Berkeley and UCLA and USC. It's not all book learning. It's learning you learn from your mama and your papa and their mamas and papas, who are your grandparents. And you absorb that and you learn how to protect yourself in situations that need awareness to protect yourself. So my parents passed it along to my brother and sister and me. Okay, so the real jump starts after a bachelor's degree at UCLA in chemistry, which was my first love in high school, Manual Arts High School, Los Angeles, and then graduate school at the University of Chicago. That was one of the toughest experiences of my life. And I look back some days now and I say, how in the heck did I get a PhD in physical chemistry, chemical physics? But I know how I did it. It meant I didn't give up. Nothing could daunt me. And if I had a barrier, I figured out the people who could help me get around the barrier, through it, over it, or under it, or to just neutralize it. That is a big point that youth today need to master. Nobody's standing there with a plate of hors d'oeuvres for you to just pick and choose what you want, because most of your experiences are not going to be what you want. But it was my elders that showed us the way. Religion was involved, yes. Common sense was involved. Getting along with people that didn't look like you was involved. And that's a key point. I was able to make allies out of people who did not, prior to meeting me, particularly warm up to people in my background. And I was told that by other professors at the University of Chicago.
Let's talk about your background a little bit. Talk about your educational background. What degrees did you achieve along the way? You started with 2, but share with us your academic, some of the.
Well, there was a high school diploma with a concentration in mathematics and science. There were about 3 dozen of us at Manual that had been early on earmarked as going to college, whether you wish to or not. You were going to get ready for college. But there were probably 2 or 3 times as many who were not tracked early, but they went on into the service. I'll get back to my point about me. And they did college later, and some did. They succeeded as well as anybody from that high school. But I had teachers that made sure that I did things right and got the right concepts, and who would, they would shake their fingers in my face and said, you got to be in chemistry 1, but this semester you're going to get an A, aren't you? That kind of direct intervention by a teacher makes a big difference.
Sure.
And then that carried me through UCLA. I was in a depressive state of mind then. I didn't realize it, but I was, after not being admitted to Harvard, Yale, and whole lot of other schools. I was so discouraged. But it was one of my dad's old friends that called us after I graduated from high school. And he said, well, how's the family? Well, this man that called was named Joe Gear. Joe was the first Black tenured professor in the whole University of California system. He was an electrical engineering professor who had transferred from Berkeley to UCLA. So he asked, well, how are the kids doing? He said, well, young Grant is still trying to get into college. So he gave his direct instructions to get me into UCLA. And that's what I did. So that's where I started. I put myself back together, and I didn't do well. I got C's in calculus the first year. I was embarrassed about that. But the second year, I took freshman chemistry, and that's when the curve went up. When it was simple inspiration, no more than that. I studied freshman Chem 1A with one of the probably the first Egyptian chemistry, chemical physicists in the United States, who came right out of Egypt, bachelor's degree, went to Florida State, PhD, first job UCLA. His name was Mustafa El Sayed. The students loved that man. He was inspirational to them. But he looked like a lot of my kinfolk anyway. So that's really what got me on track. And mathematics picked up after that. Everything else picked up after that. So you find one thing that inspires you, and it carries you through. So El Sayed said, well, you are going to graduate school, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I'd like to. I want to be a professor. Do you think I can? He says, yeah, you just do as well as you're doing here at UCLA. You'll make it. So I did get into the University of Chicago, but my graduate record exam scores were through the roof, better than my SATs when I started college. And that's what got me in. And the faculty, they were tough. They took no prisoners. There was no mollycoddling, spoon feeding. This is what we want you to learn. This is what we want you to get. And sure, we'll talk to you. You want to come in on my office hours? And then I went to finish there in 4.5 years, which was great. And that's when I began to apply for positions. Now, how are we there? I got 2 degrees at the University of Chicago, a master's of science and a PhD, a bachelor's at UCLA. Then I started to teach in 1971. I did a postdoctoral research position at UCLA Medical School. And then one of the key things that I talk about in my memoir is that a position I had worked on even before I graduated with a PhD from Chicago was an assistant professorship at University of California, San Diego, one of the top science and engineering schools in the country at that time. Somehow I was offered the job by the chemistry department. I interviewed well, but because these positions were dual, I had to have an undergraduate college. And the undergraduate college was for Third College, which was for youngsters from Latino, African American, other minority backgrounds, and the faculty hit the ceiling. They did not want that kind of approach at the university. And so that somehow fell through, and I didn't get the chemistry position either. So I had to figure my way out of that, which I did. But this goes back to ancestors. You keep going. I taught high school for 1 year. And that's when I began to connect to a higher presence in my being that would advise me.
Why did that happen in high school, teaching high school?
It was like I applied for 200 positions. I got maybe an interview and invite, but I got nothing. I said, oh, Lord, what am I going to do? I don't have a job for fall 1971. But I did get a temporary job that summer of 71 from
Hmm.
this brilliant chemist who had been at Howard University named Lloyd Ferguson, very famous in the chemistry field. They hired him as chair of chemistry at Cal State University, Los Angeles. That's different from UCLA. They're on the opposite sides of town. So Ferguson hired me for the summer as a summer lecturer. And every week, by the clock, he said, "Would you get a job yet?" I said, "No." He said, "You interested in teaching high school?" I said, "No, I want a research position, research and teaching." He asked me the next week, "You find a job?" This is how the ancestors operated. So he appointed himself as my immediate ancestor in chemistry. For 3 or 4 weeks, I said, "No, I haven't got a job." He said, "Well, this fellow's looking for high school people. You interested?" I kept saying no, no, no. But the fourth week, he gave the search guy my name and number, who called me
Hmm.
at my apartment in Westwood and said, "Dr. Ferguson said you're looking for a job teaching high school." Notice the wisdom of the ancestors. Ferguson said, "Oh, this, young brother he's being a stubborn young brother, and he's not going to have a job." So the principal, I called him and he interviewed me and he hired me on his vacation while he was at the beach. And I taught for a year. And it was one of the most wonderful things I could have done, because it was the students who taught me how to teach them. I don't mean they were standing up there with a clipboard saying, "Do this, do
Yeah.
that." They connected with me personally and I with them and said, "Oh, we don't understand this. What can you tell us more about this idea about valence, about calculations of moles and grams and milliliters and all that?" And so
Right.
gradually I assimilated more to the human side of science, namely, how do you teach it to clueless youngsters? Again, another wonderful, unexpected accident occurred at the spring recess when the physics teacher said, "Go with me as a chaperone, and we're going to take 12 of my physics students up to Morro Bay State Park and camp out for the week." And I said, "Sure, I'll go." So I went with them. I listened to the spirit inside of me that said, "Go." And I went. Um, the first day I was there, I told the physics teacher, "I'm going to drive into Cal Poly State University, which is just 12 miles from where we're staying. And I'm just going to sniff around for positions and see what's going on." I did. I talked to the chair of chemistry. Somehow the spirit guided him to do the right thing. He says, "We
Hmm.
don't have any openings right now, but I'm going to have you fill out an application right here before you leave. And I'm going to take you to lunch in the staff dining room so you could talk to some of our other faculty." What he had set up was an interview without saying it was an interview. No
Yeah.
promises, understand. But 3 weeks later, he called me. He said, "We had a sudden resignation right in your field of study. Are you still interested?" That's how I got in.
Wow. That
It
that's
was
awesome.
this other side of life that began to cue me in from then on. It was saying, don't get stuck in even promises, don't get stuck in fixed beliefs about how life is supposed to work. You're going to get into a flow on how it really works.
Right.
So, where do we go
Now,
from here?
so let me ask you, more toward the communication aspect. You've stated that physical and social sciences and their divergent languages make interdisciplinary communication practically impossible for solving society's most pressing problems. It's a mouthful, Dr. V, and I want you to use this in 2 minutes. Explain what that is, what you meant by that.
It means you surrender to interdisciplinary thinking. You get involved. You let the Spirit move you to think outside of your field. And by teaching, I began to teach analogically and said, well, this is like what Plato taught back 2,300 years in Greece. Now we're going to use that in chemistry and physics and mathematics. It meant also that other faculty colleagues began to recognize my whole interdisciplinary approach. That doesn't mean everybody liked it, because many professors are very traditional and said, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go back outside your field. I said, but that's how I work. That's how my brain operates. And that's how that began. But it also began my philosophical experimentation of watching current events in society. I would use those as teaching tools. We were having problems with immigration way back in the 70s. But I realized a very important area of electrochemistry was a perfect analog to what goes on in immigration back thousands of years. And it doesn't come because people somehow decide in another country, oh, I think they're doing well. Like I see what's happening in the United States on the television and what I read. I think I want to take my family over there. Well, that's how one particular political philosophy looks, and they have no right to come over here and take away our blessings that we've developed, worked hard on in America. Electrochemistry teaches you that when we have electrochemical reactions, like when sodium is reacting with hydrochloric acid, something like that, there's electrons being transferred and those electrons do what people do when they immigrate. Electrons will move from one system into another system. And they don't move because they say, oh, I think I like that system. No, it's because once they're in a system, the whole environment of that system gives them what's called a voltage reading that expresses their attachment to that system. But in another system, they may have a very low attachment to that system, and it has a very low voltage reading. But if you somehow connect these systems together, the electrons over here that have a low attachment for the system, maybe that's over here, but anyway, they go, there's a balancing. Electrons start to flow. The ones that don't want to be where they are flow over here to where electrons want to be there. And it keeps flowing until you release. It results in a balance between the two systems. And it sorts out a benefit for electrons overall, whether they stay in proximity over here or over there. That's how immigration needs to work. That's what I mean. But people can't talk about immigration properly unless they learn electrochemistry. And the electrochemists have a hard time talking about immigration because they didn't study political science. They didn't study economics, global economics. So it's hard. The linguistics is missing to solve our problems.
Well, Dr. V, I said at the beginning of the show that I knew it would probably be like this. You have so much information. You're so knowledgeable on various subject matters relating to science and math. The show is coming to a close. I just want you to take 15, 30 seconds just to give the audience something that you want them to take away from this show, and then we'll close it out. Please feel free.
The takeaway is that nothing I've done there's nothing that has not served me later. I didn't know the early experiences, even what I thought were disappointing failures, were getting me ready by reacting constructively instead of embitteredly, elevated me to the next phase of my ability. So over the next 20 or 30 years, I became a leader in 3 universities in their academic operation until I became a provost. Well, provost is high as you can go unless you want to be a president. But I didn't need to be a president. I had as much influence as a provost to do that.
Well,
and now I'm retired from that, so I sit and write about
great.
what I
And
see.
you've written so many books that people can purchase on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. Everyone who's listening, look up Dr. Venerable's, Dr. V's books on Barnes and Noble.
Footprints. The word is footprints in chaos. And they'll find it. That's all they need.
It's awesome having you on the show today. Your humility shows. You're a scholar. You have so much information. I enjoyed the education today. Thank you so much for joining Undiscovered Gems.
Well, thank you so much for the conversation.
All right. See you next time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Undiscovered Gems with our host, Charles D. Smith, highlighting today's best and brightest business minds. Brought to you by Pods Entertainment Group.